Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to Home Education Matters. And today I'm joined by Luke Dadford. And I reached out to Luke to come on the podcast because he wrote a very interesting blog post about the use of artificial intelligence. And it occurred to me that as home educators, this is perhaps something that we're increasingly seeing around and that our children are becoming more and more exposed to. And so I wanted to speak to Luke about the use of AI and things like ChatGPT and that kind of thing in education. So first of all, Luke, thank you so much for joining me today. And would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about you?
Hi, my name's Luke Dadford. I write a blog, as Eleanor said, and I've touched on AI before, and I plan to write a little bit more about it in the future. While I'm not a home educator myself, members of my family are, and so I have some exposure to that sort of side of things. And I think it's interesting to sort of think about how the world of education generally will be impacted by artificial intelligence.
Is this something you've studied or something you've looked at sort of for a job or anything like that?
Informally, yes. I don't have formal education in this area, as of yet, at least. I'd potentially like to in the future.
And so what led you to writing a blog?
I suppose it was more just general interest, because I follow a lot of people on Twitter or on other blog posts or forums. I sort of started to read a lot, and when you start to read a lot and sort of get exposed to all these ideas, I think writing a blog is useful for a number of reasons. One, there's a big one for me, is to sort of clarify your own thoughts, to sort of, process it all and think, okay, where do I actually stand in terms of all this? The other is to sort of help anyone else that might be in a similar position to you or to where you were in terms of trying to figure out what's going on here. I certainly would have and do appreciate these kinds of things, these kinds of resources. And I hope it sort of scratches that itch for people.
And does it have a theme, your blog, or is it just on whatever sort of is interesting you at the time?
Well, I've just recently started it, so I try to keep it as non-committed to any one specific area. My first few blog posts are going to be themed around AI, but I'm actually an economics student, and so I plan to write a little bit related to that at some point in the future, maybe some other topics of interest.
What sort of economicist? Wait, let me try that one again. What sort of economist are you? Are you, I know they've got very fancy terms for economists now. You're not just like left or capitalist or whatever. I know they have super fancy terms like progressive, left, free market or something. So what would you classify yourself as?
Well, that's more sort of the politics side of things. But in terms of economics as a field, it's more sort of micro or macro or econometrics, which is about basically empirical economics, so about trying to actually study what are the effects, what are the causal effects of this policy or that change, which is a really fascinating field that sort of got big from sort of the 1980s onwards. It's something I'm passionate about and would like to write about at some point, even though I'm still sort of learning myself.
It's interesting how AI and economics meet, because I went to a lecture by I feel like he was I think he was a statistician actually, and he said Spiegel something, and he was
Spiegelman.
I went to a lecture by him, and
I actually know this guy. Sorry, not Spiegelman.
Spiegelheister or some Spiegel.
Yes, I know exactly who you mean.
He did a lot of statistics.
Spiegelhalter.
Yeah, he did.
Yes.
And I went to a lecture by him, and everyone was asking questions, and I asked whether he thought that AI was going to make statisticians redundant in the future, and I got very told off. You really didn't like that question, because I would have thought that AI, when it comes to analysing economics and when it comes to analysing statistics, will actually be really taking away a lot of the sort of the grunt work of statisticians and economists. Would you see it in that way?
It's interesting. It's interesting you bring up statistics, because there's a lot of sort of debate, certainly in those kinds of fields, about what is AI. How do we actually define AI? Because there's a lot of overlap in terms of modern AI, at least. It wasn't so much like that back in the 70s or whatever, where it's more you had this approach called symbolic learning, which was quite different to the sort of machine learning of today. But today there's a lot of overlap with statistics, and so you'll see sometimes some sort of pushback from people in more sort of economics and statistics fields about labeling some of these models as AI, when a lot of it is sort of using statistical modeling and stuff. And so there's a sort of a question of how do we define and delineate what is AI.
That's interesting, because my first question to you, before we sort of look at how AI might impact in education and specifically with home education, my first question was going to be, what is AI and how do we define it? Because to be honest, statistical modeling, I would have thought, has a lot of AI going on, but are they trying to kind of separate that out now and say that's not AI in some way? Because isn't AI purely that in some way?
Most sort of current approaches are sort of using statistical models. Yeah. As I say, that wasn't always the case, but these days, yeah, there's an awful lot of overlap in terms of the sort of techniques used. As for how to actually define AI, that's a really good question, and I'm reluctant to give an answer.
I'm going to have to push you for an answer, just like Jeremy Paxman would. I'm going to have to push you for an answer, Luke. I'm afraid.
I would say some statistical or mathematical or code-based model that can replicate or appear to replicate some aspect of human behavior or something. I don't know. If I were to give a very very off the cuff sort of intuitive answer, but yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of holes someone could pick in that and go, but what about this?
No, that seems like a good definition to me. So, and this is obviously this idea of replicating to a degree the processing of the human mind. So you got the input, then you got the processing, then you got the output, and that's been a popular idea of human consciousness pretty much since we entered the computer age. So this idea of input, process, output. So I'm guessing that when it comes to AI, the processing is just done by a computer, and what they do, I guess, I don't know much about it, I guess they take all the information they can find online and they use that as their processing. So just as we would maybe take all of our memories and our experiences and use that as our processing power within our brain, the computer takes everything that's on the internet and then uses that as to give some sort of data for it to do the processing. Is that about right?
Well, yeah, modern. I'm mostly talking here about large language models, so LLMs. Things like ChatGPT is probably the most well-known example. Yeah, these are trained on huge data sets of internet data. So we're talking petabytes, I think. So where a petabyte is terabytes even. Sorry. I think it's terabytes. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but yeah, just massive amounts of. So a terabyte is a lot, as I'm sure you know, like 1,000 gigabytes. But we're talking about terabytes of text, purely text data. So this is, okay, well, GPT-4 was trained on more than purely text, technically, but still.
What did it take other than just text? Because I've always assumed that something like ChatGPT just basically has harvested as much text as possible that we've populated onto the internet and then uses that as its data. But is it doing more than that?
Yes and no. So there are two sort of training stages, or two main types of training stages when it comes to modern LLMs. There's the pre-training stage, which is basically just give it a load of text data from the internet to train on. Not any text data. They do sort of discriminate to some extent. What they want to use what they called high quality data. But basically, it's then tasked with predicting the next word or word chunk for a given section of that text data. And that's basically the goal of the pre-training stage, basically to get very good at predicting how to continue a string of text.
I see, that's really interesting, because it reminds me a little bit of when you put something into Google search and it sort of tries to complete your answer, and invariably it comes up with really stupid things.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it makes you think, God, are people actually searching for this? Because that is crazy, right? You put in, like, I don't know, do rabbits, and then they do things like go to Nova Scotia, and you're like, who even searched for that? I mean, but yet ChatGPT doesn't do that. ChatGPT does give really sensible.
Yeah. So that's the first stage of training. Then ChatGPT uses a pre-trained model, which is basically an LLM that has been undergone that training, which I just talked about, and then it undergoes a second training stage, which we call fine-tuning, which is where it's basically trained on usually much smaller sets of data, and they're usually formatted differently as well. And the goal there is to basically train it for to be good at specific tasks. So be it or to have certain qualities. So be it for honesty, because if it's just an autocomplete machine, it could say anything really. Or if there are certain safeguards you want to be in place, you can try to train it to avoid talking about certain topics. That's something that's often done.
How do you train an AI to be honest?
Well, it's very difficult, and it's certainly not foolproof. But so there are sort of two methods that ChatGPT uses, as far as I'm aware. The first is what's called supervised learning, where they basically just give it a bunch of examples. This is a good example, this is a bad example, this is a good example, this is a bad example. And the hope is that from seeing all these different examples, it can eventually learn, what to do and what not to do, from sort of feeding in all that data. And the other sort of training method that's used in this fine-tuning stage, certainly by ChatGPT at least, is what's called reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is a little bit more complicated. But basically, this is where they actually get humans to come in, like actual human evaluators, to judge and rank, usually, a bunch of different examples of statements or responses that have been generated. And they do this again and again and again until eventually they have built up basically a function, a reward model for how to score the highest as judged by these human judges. And then they use that reward model to then train the actual LLM itself. It's a little bit complicated.
No, I get it. So the first stage is just like pile it full of data. Then the second fine-tuning stage is when you would try
to make it
more like a human.
Basically, yes. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Rather than just solely predicting what is the next most likely word or word chunk. That's when you try to make it more human-like, I suppose.
So ChatGPT is obviously the biggest and most popular at the moment, or at least it's the one that's in the news. It's the one I've heard of. So
I think that's fair to say.
Okay, that's good then. So what other ones are out there, and is there any value in using one over another when it comes to education?
Yes, but it's changing very fast, and it's hard to predict exactly how things are going to go. And in fact, I think it was actually last night. I thought it was this morning, but it was actually late last night. But I woke up to see it this morning. Google actually released a paper detailing their latest large language model, Palm 2, which is what they're basically. So this is a pre-trained model, but they are going to use it for their sort of chatbot AI called Bard, which is currently using Palm 1. So they're going to basically use that as their base for Bard. And this came out last night. This is what I mean. It's so rapid. It's not just sort of this year this happened, or that last year this happened. It's more sort of every week or every few days there's some new development or something. So it's very difficult to recommend specific actions or policy advice, because there's so much uncertainty and so much happening so quickly. It's hard to say exactly how it's going to develop and over what timescales.
Do you think there will be any sort of limits put on the use of, you're calling them like NLMs?
LLMs, so large language models.
LLMs. Okay, so do you think there'll be any restrictions put on the use of LLMs when it comes to education? Because I know that I've spoken to some teachers and they say they just can't keep up with it. It's exactly the same with plagiarizing, isn't it? the education sector is always behind the technology sector, of course, and so it's always playing catch up. So do you think there will be a stage when restrictions will be put on LLMs?
You mean by the government or by specific educators?
Mainly by universities and schools
Right.
and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's very likely. How effective it'll actually be, I'm somewhat doubtful of, because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to reliably demonstrate when someone has used a large language model like ChatGPT. Yes, if you're lazy and you just copy paste, it can be often fairly simple to detect. But assuming you're not, and you actually sort of rephrase it in some way, or try to put it in a more natural tone that matches your own tone.
Is that predominantly how it's getting detected now? Is that people are reading this, teachers are reading this and just saying, yeah, that doesn't sound like Bob's normal writing?
I don't know too much about from the perspective of teachers themselves, but yeah, if you sort of play around with these things enough, you can definitely start to pick up on these kinds of things. The sort of the formalness, the sort of it's hard to put into words, but there's a certain tone often that they take in terms of, it could be this, it could be that, but it could also be this. Just very sort of, yeah. You learn to pick up on these things basically.
I found when I've been using it that it tends to sound kind of overly formal.
Yes,
Regardless
absolutely.
of what it's writing about. And so I'm guessing if you sort of set your child to write an essay on Henry V and they come out with something that really does sound like the editor of The Guardian wrote it, then I'm guessing that's a bit of a red flag.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely, especially if you're used to their normal style of writing and you see this massive jump. That would be obviously a massive red flag. I think the main use cases, the main legitimate quote unquote use cases for I suppose supplementing learning are more in terms of idea generation. So this is a really good use case I found. If you want some ideas for I don't know, say I want to go on holiday. It's a really bad example in the context of education, but give me some examples of overlooked holiday destinations, for example, or something like that, in terms of enhancing creativity. And because I feel, if generally I'm someone who is not overly creative, and so I think definitely that's somewhere where I've noticed it's sort of helped me in terms of idea generation and thinking of things I might not have thought of before.
So one advantage of using a large language model would be that as a home educator, you could ask it for ideas. So you could sort of say,
Yes.
I mean, I know, for example, for myself, when my daughter was revising for her English language exam recently, I asked it to give me some descriptive writing essay titles. And it gave me some descriptive writing essay titles. So I didn't have to go through all the past papers. And I'm guessing it's a similar kind of thing that maybe home educators can use it as generating ideas. So you can sort of say what science experiments would be good if in the kitchen, if what kitchen experiments are good if you want to learn about volcanoes, and tell me about rock formation and things like that. So it's almost like a kind of starter for ideas. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's sort of where it's at its best. Or another useful legitimate quote unquote use case, I think, is for giving feedback for either your own writing or its answers. So if you ask it to self-reflect on what it's given, sort of refine it.
So you would say that another advantage of using a large language model would be that it gives feedback and it allows maybe almost for the child to put their writing in and then get almost like marking, almost in a way, or is it more just verbal feedback or written feedback?
More, yeah, I'm thinking more sort of verbal feedback. So how could I make this article more formal, or how could I rephrase this piece of writing to talk more about this or that? I don't know, but or how could I rephrase this so it's more concise, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean,
or just a more open-ended thing, like asking it to critique something that you've written, because it can be hard sometimes to step out of your own shoes and sort of evaluate something you've written critically.
Yeah, it can very much. And also, I'm guessing it's helpful maybe if you've been asked to summarize a piece of text, maybe you've read an article about a political article, and then your home education task is to summarize that in 200 words. Then you could ask ChatGPT to do the same kind of thing, and you could kind of compare your summary, something like that, almost comparison texts as well.
Yeah, I think that could work.
Okay, so what other advantages are there to ChatGPT and other large language models?
I think it's quite good for explaining concepts or summarizing some writing if you have to read something and you don't really like the way that they're trying to explain something. So if you have, say, some some writing you have to read as an assignment, and you're trying to understand some concept that's trying to describe, but the explanation just isn't making sense to you. You can sort of ask it about the subject of that piece of writing, or ask it to try to rephrase it in a more easy to comprehend form, I suppose.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
could you, for example, if you were to be studying Jane Austen as an example for your English literature,
sure.
before you start reading it and studying it, you could actually ask ChatGPT for a kind of 500 words summary of the novel, and then you've kind of got somewhere to go before you start reading it, that kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, you've with something like a book, you've got to be aware of whether the book itself is actually in its training data. If it's something common and that's sort of open domain or whatever, then yeah, there's a good chance that it will be familiar with that. Or even if it hasn't read the text itself, it would have been trained on a lot of writing about the text in question. But there are also sort of plugins now that allow you to sort of input an entire PDF, and so that's sort of becoming more feasible to summarize or to give feedback on large text documents, whereas previously it sort of wasn't so much.
Hit me with more advantages. Are there any more advantages? Are we advantaged out of ChatGPT?
I think that's all I can sort of think of for now.
Hmm.
But yeah, I suppose it's just useful generally to see it as a tool to enhance your learning rather than to replace it for you. Rather
To
than
write your
cheating yourself
answers.
out of actually getting an education, it can actually help you be more productive and to get unstuck if you're stuck on some concept or whatever.
Yeah. And I can see from what you've said that it would be useful, that I think it's important for parents and students to recognize how it's useful and in what ways it's
Sure.
useful. So what about its limitations or the things that disadvantages perhaps of using it?
Right. So yeah, hallucinations. As it
What?
is. Oh yeah, sorry.
Hallucinations?
So yeah, this is the sort of the lingo for when it basically makes something up or
Oh. I thought that
disregards what you've said in some way, or
I thought
otherwise.
that's what happens if you just use it too much. You start hallucinating.
No. This is a sort of an anthropomorphism used to describe a large language model when it basically makes something up or disregards what you've entered, what you're trying to ask it for, or there are a number of different ways I've seen it used, but generally it's if it makes something up in some way. And so you've got to be aware of that, and certainly it's worth checking, specifically if you don't really know about a thing that it's trying to tell you about. Certainly for anything important, like on an assignment or anything. And so it's arguably not so much of an issue now, even though it is still very much a thing that exists. But so for sort of the older models of like ChatGPT, before you sort of had internet sort of access and things like that, if you were to ask it about things that occurred after it was trained, so GPT 3.5, which is the sort of basic free model of ChatGPT, I think the most recent sort of dates that it knows about in terms of being in its training data is 2019 or something. And so if you were to ask it about events after that, what you would find is that it would often answer confidently, but the answers would be complete guesswork, basically. But it would confidently assert, oh yes, in 2021, this happened. This person won this election.
Just because that's what it thinks was going to happen, almost.
Yeah, because Well, yeah, partly because it's a text continua, and partly because I imagine in the fine tuning stage, a lot of the time the human judges probably didn't know exactly what the actual answers were, so they would just prefer an answer that sounded confident than an I don't know sort of answer.
It's still taking data now, though, all the time, I'm guessing, right?
Well,
It's
yeah. Well,
not
sorry,
just
I'm talking more about the older model. And now with the sort of paid version of GPT-4, you can use plugins, so you can actually allow it to access the internet and sort of search these things itself. This is more sort of an older thing. I mean, hallucinations are still, an issue, but they're somewhat less of an issue now than they were, at least, even though they do still very much exist.
so you need to be a bit careful about what information it produces and maybe double check it if it's
Hmm.
something that's more important
Well,
than
if
like
yeah, well,
holiday
certainly.
destinations.
Again, this is more a thing. Yeah. Well, again, this is more sort of an issue with the older models and like without having access to the internet. But yeah, it could completely and still can to some extent. Make up sources. For example, if you ask it to give sources, you can just completely hallucinate, as it's called, fake sources for the answers that it gives. So you've got to be careful, be aware that this is something that can happen.
Okay. What other disadvantages would you say, or things to watch out for when you're using it, particularly in education?
You mean from the perspective of students, or
Yeah, let's go from the perspective of students, and then we can talk about the perspective of parents afterwards.
that's a good one. I suppose just generally be aware that things are moving very fast, at least at the moment. How long this will continue for is it's another debate. But yeah, don't assume that the strengths and benefits of these kinds of models today will be the same in even a couple of years, and that the use cases could also change quite rapidly. I suppose just generally be aware that this is very fast moving.
So try to keep up to date with what's happening.
I'm hesitant to give that advice because it's kind of impractical and not very satisfying. But yeah, it's really a tricky situation for educators, and I really do sympathise because it's very difficult to update a curriculum for the future, just in general, because there's obviously an identification lag in terms of when you have to identify what is going to be relevant for the workplace of tomorrow, and then there's the lag of the students of today actually growing up and going into the workforce, and you obviously have to do a lot of prediction and looking forward, and it's very easy to get that wrong, especially when things are moving so fast like this. So yeah, it's very difficult to give specific advice.
What about for parents or for home educating parents? So what sort of things should they be sort of worried about or looking out for, or sort of just being aware of?
I think just a general awareness that these tools exist, and I suppose to a certain extent how to recognize basic sort of lazy use of these tools, as well as the fact that they are sort of rapidly changing and progressing, and sort of becoming more advanced would be beneficial, at least. Again, I'm very, very hesitant to give specific advice because it could change completely in a few years.
That's so true. And I think when it comes to all of these things, just like, I mean, I'm considerably older than you, Luke, and so I remember a world pre-internet. Yes, indeed. And it's one of those things where it's just a medium, and just like books and screens, it's all how you use them rather than something inherent in the thing itself. And so for all of these things, it's really about how the parent interacts with the child using ChatGPT, and how the child recognizes that it's a tool and how to use it and how not to use it,
Sure.
I'm guessing. Okay, so thank you so much for coming
Thank
on
you.
the podcast today. Do tell us what your blog is called, and how we can find your blog for any of our listeners.
Right. So my blog is ideamill.substack.com. And also, if you'll allow me, I'd like to shout out another relevant blog. This is not mine, but this is someone else who has written about topics that might be of interest to you or your listeners. So this is Ethan Mollick, who writes at One Useful Thing. He's actually an educator himself, and I've read a few of his blog posts. I believe he teaches sort of entrepreneurship or something like that, and he's recently tried integrating the use of ChatGPT and other AI tools into some of his lessons. And so that's potentially, something to look into if you want to read more.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that was One Useful Thing, and yours
Yes,
is
One Useful Thing.
and yours is Idea Mill at Substack.
Ideamill.substack.com.
Substack. Perfect. Well, thank you, Luke. It's been a Pleasure to have you on. I feel like I am much more armed now for when I go into my ChatGPT and ask it random information about the world. So
Thank you.
thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.